So, toward freedom struggles for independence, here we're talking about a struggle for decolonization, really the process that is going to mark a dramatic change within the world's kind of political architecture. Nation states that had triumphed previously over the world, really, and the empires that had structured much of that. So the focus on colonial rule will have subordination, poverty, racism that exists here. And we'll see a decline in legitimacy of empire and race, kind of as credible bases for political and social life. In the late 1940s, we see the Philippines, India, Pakistan, Burma, Indonesia, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Israel all achieve independence for themselves. Mid 1950s to 1970s, 50 African colonies will achieve independence during that time period as well. And in the 1970s, we see places like Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, the Solomon Islands, all becoming independent too. The Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago will become independent in the 60s and 70s, and then Cuba becomes independent in 1902, and they reject any kind of American control around 1959 during this time. So the end of empire in world history. Um, the process was the latest kind of idea of the end of imperial dissolution. Um, so with this nationalist ideology, we see the end of the empire associated with that. They claim kind of an international status as well. And we start to see empires falling in the 20th century. The Austrian and Ottoman empires ending after World War One, the Russian Empire that will end as well, and then Germany and Japan, the German and Japanese empires that will end following World War Two. Um, Empires kind of without territory, like the United States, really have exercised in Latin America in those areas. Um, so not necessarily territory driven, but we do have a heavy involvement in some of the things that are taking place there. There's this idea behind national self determination. Um, so it's really this global acceptance of self determination, the ability to really figure out for yourself what you want to do. And then obviously, empires without territory come under attack as well. So, like the US involvement in Latin America, things like the Mexican Revolution as well become a big part of this. The last territorial empires fall at the end of the 20th century. So the Soviet Union in 1991 falls after their long, when we say long, really 40, almost 40 years of kind of reign. But China will actually remain intact despite considerable resistance from other places like Tibet and so on and so forth there. When we look at independence towards Asia and Africa, so when we look at the democratic European state values and the idea behind national self-determination, it goes against a lot of colonial rule realities. So why does it happen? What's the timing of it? Well, Europe's been weakened by the world wars, so that's a huge part of the idea of independence, especially within Asia and Africa. Europe no longer is seen as necessarily morally superior in ways. They aren't viewed in that realm anymore. The new superpowers, which is the US and the USSR, against kind of the older European colonial empires, they don't necessarily look to have colonies per se, but they have spheres of influence over others, and that was enough. People were believed that they were necessary of them, and that became a big reason. And European colonies were vulnerable really without local elites or educated Westerners during this time period as well. There's social and economic factors for anti colonial movements as well. We see second and third generation kind of educated elites insisting on immediate independence. They didn't feel colonial rule was actually necessary for progress itself. And common people are increasingly receptive to that idea. So these groups of people that are moving in a lot of ways become a big part of this. You also get colonial rulers who are on the defensive as well. Um, we look at planning for decolonization, things like political reform, including political reform, investments in things like railroads, um, pressure from nationalist movements as well, that becomes a big part of this too. This map here, the second half of the 20th century, has pressure from nationalist movements. So Europe's kind of Asian and African empires will dissolve into dozens of new independent states. And it really alters the structure of international life as we look at it. So on this map here, you can see Belgium is their independence years. So you get out of Belgium, Rwanda, and Burundi. And the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1960, they're around there. France gives up a lot of area within Africa and even also into Asia as well. Great Britain, as we know, huge parts of this. You can see in the light green there, their areas of influence. Italy, not as many. Okay, the Netherlands in blue, much smaller in a lot of their areas of influence. Okay, Portugal, mainly in Africa. The United States, as we see it, really only in the Philippines, and then any others that would be a part of this as well as they move forward. This portrait here, guys, many countries do, and colonies actually win their independence through things like peaceful political pressure, but others find it necessary to actually adopt a military strategy for it. This is a group of Algerian fighters from the National Liberation Front in 1960. They were established in 1954. The NLF, or the National Liberation Front, was the major organization within Algeria that led the country to their independence from France. So, continuing on with this struggle for things, the nationalist movements themselves are going to be a part of this. A lot of times, mostly male leaders who are generally speaking going to be educated. They would organize political parties. They'd recruit, plan strategy, develop ideas, negotiate with colonial states. Some are considered fathers of the country. Some will direct military, administrative areas, liberated areas as well. And they seek to join the modern world of other independent nations, the United Nations itself, modern technology, etc. Leaders have to go out and recruit followers. So, for example, Gandhi had millions of nonviolent followers. Rarely cohesive groups of people who were oppressed. They usually have tensions with one another. So within the Indian National Congress, Mahatma Gandhi rejects industrialization, whereas Lieutenant Nehru actually embraces it. So two different sides within the Indian National Congress. Gandhi was nonviolent. He held everyone as equal, tries to improve the position of women and untouchables within that caste system that existed in India. And some thought those efforts actually distracted from independence in a lot of ways. There's a Hindu slash and Muslim divide too. And in 1947, India became Pakistan, Muslim, and India, mostly Hindu. So you see the divide between the two there. When we look at this, we also see that there's varying ideals of characteristics within the movement itself. Independent in years or decades at times, there's usually some kind of distant colonial power. or a white settler minority that exists here. And there's peaceful political pressure versus armed struggle. And so you see all these different areas taking place here. And when we look at it, okay, the different ideologies for seeking independence is religious in India, Islamic world, or secular. Okay, are you breaking off as a religious group, or are you breaking off as more of a worldly group that's just going to be a country? And then you have Marxism and communist views that can all take place here as well. So this here is the most widely recognized and admired figure in the global struggle against colonial rule. It's Mohandas Gandhi, also known as Mahatma or Great Soul, shown here with his granddaughter Ava to his left and his personal physician, Sushila Nayar, on the right there. So when we look at this, after their freedom, what takes place? All right, after their freedom, what takes place? Common conditions are really going to be a big part of this as well. You have an exploding kind of population that exists. You have diverse cultures that are going to be a part of this as well. And a growing public employment as a state assumed a lot more responsibility for economic development. Europeans had kind of established a democratic institution in a lot of different colonies before the colonial rule ends. And so we see it works best within India itself. Elsewhere, there's fragile or degenerated into corrupt personal tyrannies or kind of big man dictatorships that exist within here. You have dozens of military takeovers within Africa in the early 1980s due to a lot of conflict there. Multiple military interventions within Latin America in the 60s and 70s as well. And then we see globalization of democracy in the late 20th century. Popular movements, multi-party elections, constitutions that are brand new in many of those countries, for instance, Spain, Portugal, and Greece. And democracy is increasingly viewed as a universal principle at this time. Authoritarian governments are failing to fix economic situations, and there's a growth within the civil society as well. So some leaders and governments turn to authoritarian or corrupt in office types of ideals. So democracy really is going to become the increasing popular movement as we move forward through this. The end of communism, okay, as we look at it here. So the end of communism is going to end really the Cold War itself. It also lessens the threat of nuclear war. It brings about the birth of about 20 new nations as well, and nation states itself. And the steps to end of the communist era. So in China in 1970s, the CCP abandoned what was the Maoist communism that had existed under Mao Zedong. In Eastern Europe in 1989, you have popular movements that are overthrowing the communist government as well. And then obviously with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, that ends that semblance of communism. So when we look at it, what are the failures? They couldn't compete economically with capitalism. That's one of the big parts of this is capitalist economies were just at this point in time really better than the communist ones. And morally, it was inferior to democracy and human rights. In a lot of ways, people were making decisions for you in that. So we see the end of communism within that too. When we look beyond kind of Mao and China, Deng Xiaoping is going to lead after Mao Zedong. And he dismantles what was collective farming and slow industrial reform as well. So there's great authority to the state managers, especially enterprise zones with kind of foreign investments, township and village enterprises. Deng's kind of reforms that come out of this, there's huge economic growth. There's more prosperity for the millions of people. You see better diets, lower mortality rate. The decline in poverty was big under this. But some of the downsides to his reforms are massive corruption amongst officials. We know that can happen even in capitalist countries. Regional inequality, so certain areas are better off than others. We see that too within the United States. You could argue that the East Coast and the West Coast are probably better off economically than, say, the middle of the country is. Urban overcrowding, which is something that definitely exists. City pollution, which is huge. Periodic inflation that can happen because of those. And then urban vices that would surface as well. Now, the grasp on power, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is not necessarily willing to promote democracy, but they relinquish kind of an ideal behind political monopoly. So we have things like the Tiananmen Square demonstration that is crushed in the late 1980s as a part of this as well. This portrait here is all early 21st century communist values of selflessness, community, and simplicity. It'd been replaced by a lot of Western style commercialism and consumerism. The New Year's Good Luck poster from 1993 kind of illustrates a new interest in material wealth in the form of American dollars and the return of older Chinese cultural patterns that kind of represents the gods of wealth there. So you see a mixing of those two.